Connecticut is one of the top financial centers in the United States, and its per capita income is also at the forefront of the world. 5 years ago, the virus broke out in the world. Connecticut was no exception. Like other cities, it put a stay-at-home order in place. People were stuck at home and couldn't go out, and loads of businesses in catering and retail had to close. But actually, this was not the first time Connecticut had been through something like this. 68 years ago, the people there felt a kind of fear that felt like it was stopping them from breathing. In those days, people would lock their doors really tight and would not go outside, and after sunset, all kinds of shops would close doors. It was not because of a virus, it was because of two real men wandering the streets, Joseph Taborsky and Arthur Culombe, who committed a series of brutal robberies and murders. In addition, there's so much drama in the story of Joseph and Arthur. Joseph is the only criminal in Connecticut's history who's been sentenced to death twice for different crimes. Arthur never knew he had the right to remain silent or the right to legal counsel, and his confession was made after being put through the ringer for days and the cops threatening him. Joseph was born in Hartford on the 23rd of March 1924. He was the eldest in his family, with a younger brother and two sisters. His mother was a proper religious woman, spent all her time running the house and keeping the family going. His father was a salesman who worked door to door, had a mental disability, and was often away from home. As the eldest son, Joseph didn't get the attention from his mother that he should have, and he also lacked the fatherly love and guidance he needed. When Joseph was 7 years old, he committed his first crime, stealing a bike, and in the following months, he continued to commit several counts of burglary and shoplifting. Later on, his mother remembered that Joseph had nicked a bike out of resentment after his own bike had been stolen. She was a housewife who had to look after several kids and a husband with mental disabilities. She didn't have much time to correct his psychology and behavior. So she thought that Joseph's bike theft was just a way of dealing with his emotional issues. However, several months later, Joseph pinched another bike, and at that time, he got sent down to a juvenile detention center for 9 months. Not long after, Joseph was sentenced to an extra 3 to 5 years in prison for escaping. The prison walls didn't stop him wanting to be free, but they did lock him up for most of his youth. Every time he got out of prison, he tried to get back into a normal life, working as a laborer and a truck driver. But it didn't take long before he was back in the prison for theft. Back in 1948, Joseph, aged 24, started working at a freight transportation facility, where he first met his partner in crime, Arthur. Arthur was the same age, but he was as clueless as a 9-year-old, couldn't read or tell time. And later, a police officer said that Arthur's learning disability meant he was very easily influenced. For instance, on August 21st, 1944, Arthur was involved in the burglary and robbery of 2 service stations in Hartford with 2 other criminals. And in the very next day, he was involved in another robbery. As a result, Joseph, who was ambitious and had bad intentions, saw Arthur, who was intellectually limited, as the easiest person to manipulate. On March 23, 1950, Joseph, aged 26, was at a crossroads in his life, and he chose a path that would take him down a one-way street. That day, he and his brother Albert had planned to rob Louis's liquor store in West Hartford. Louis was just an ordinary businessman who worked hard every day to make a living, yet he became a victim of this terrible crime. During the robbery, Joseph and Albert accidentally shot Louis in the face. Louis was really badly hurt. Although he made it to hospital, he was close to dying. But he was still managed to give the police a description of the gunman. He said, light hair, baby face, medium height, as he was breathing his last. In reality, this description didn't match the physical characteristics of Joseph and Albert, especially Joseph, who was about 6 feet 4 inches tall, had black hair, and a prominent chin. Because of the wrong description of the suspect, the murder case was still unsolved for a whole year. It was not until Albert, unable to bear the torment at his conscience, voluntarily surrendered to the police and admitted that he and his brother killed Louis. After the jury talked it over for 9 hours, they decided Joseph should be sentenced to death for first-degree murder on June 7, 1951, and Albert was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. While he was waiting to be executed, Joseph showed that he was a good lying, always saying that he was innocent. Meanwhile, Albert's mental state completely collapsed, and he was transferred to the prison's mental health department and then to Norwich State Hospital. As the witness who sent Joseph to death row, Albert's mental breakdown brought the case back into the public spotlight. Then, Joseph and his defense attorneys seized this opportunity, bribing some newspapers to label the Louis murder case as the Cain and Abel case. They claimed that out of jealousy and anger, Albert wanted to kill Joseph, so he deliberately confessed to send Joseph to death row. Albert's mental health issues and public opinion put pressure on the local court, who then said that the evidence used to convict Joseph and sentence him to death and keep him in prison was not enough. Joseph was let out of prison on the 6th of October 1955. Before he was let out of death row, Joseph did an interview in prison saying, "How can such great injustice be done to the innocent? If you could only realize the feeling of helplessness I had, it hurts me especially to see my mother suffer." Less than a year after he got out of prison, Joseph moved from Hartford to Brooklyn, New York, and married a woman who had often written to him while he was on death row. But his marriage and work were a bit rocky, which left Joseph feeling a bit lost. September 1956, Joseph got back in touch with Arthur and decided to team up with him for crimes. They started out committing burglaries and shop robberies in Hartford and the Rocky Mountains of Connecticut, but gradually moved on to murders. In early December, they robbed a hotel, but luckily the staff got away without any harm. Several days later, they hit a liquor store in Hartford. Jack, the owner of this liquor store, was constantly being beaten by Joseph and Arthur with a handgun. 7 days later, the Rocky Mountains became the stage for their evil deeds. They robbed a local store of at least $100, and the store owner was also beaten with a handgun. 4 days later, on December 15, 1956, Nicola, a 67-year-old tailor, was working in his shop when Joseph and Arthur burst in and shot him in the face. Luckily, the bullet only went into his neck and didn't kill him. An hour after Nicola was almost murdered, Joseph and Arthur drove to a petrol station in New Britain. Their minds were set on two things: robbing the place and killing anyone who got in their way. The gas station owner was Edward, a hard-working 30-year-old veteran. At the time, Edward was working on a car. So while they were filling up the tank, Joseph said he had to use the toilet and told Edward that Arthur would pay for the petrol. But after paying, Arthur went up to Edward and pulled out a Russian-style revolver. He threatened Edward, saying, "Go into the boiler room, or I will kill you." In that tiny space, Arthur shot Edward and stole his wallet. Meanwhile, Joseph took the money from the cash register. At this unfortunate moment, Daniel, also 30 years old and with his infant daughter in the car, pulled up to the gas station and parked at the entrance. Joseph and Arthur had just finished robbing the place and were planning to wait for Daniel to leave, but he didn't. So they decided to take action. They slowly approached Daniel's car, with Arthur pretending to check the vehicle to distract Daniel. Then, out of the blue, Joseph got closer, pointed a gun at Daniel and said he had to get out of the car, hand over his wallet and go to the restroom at the gas station, and there, Joseph shot Daniel in the head without hesitation. After that, Joseph and Arthur quickly left the crime scene. They drove to Arthur's house, split the stolen money evenly, and threw the bloodied revolver in a nearby shallow pond. Several hours later, Joseph went back to his home in Brooklyn, New York, as if nothing had happened. The next day, Edward and Daniel were found. Daniel's daughter was found safe in the car, but she'd fallen asleep from being hungry and tired. Both victims had been in the United States Armed Forces. So the double murder sent shockwaves through the whole state of Connecticut. The governor offered a reward of $3,000 for info that would lead to the arrest and conviction of the murderers, and the mayor of New Britain added another $2,000. The state police also set up a special task force to handle the case, which became known as the Mad Dog Killings. Just 6 days later, on December 21st, 1956, the pair went after a grocery store in Coventry. The store was owned by 64-year-old Vinton and his wife, and at the time their granddaughter, 3-year-old Lori was also in the store. What was meant to be a cozy family moment was ruined by Joseph and Arthur barging in. They beat Vinton and his wife with a gun and stole $100. During the ordeal, Joseph told Arthur to kill Lori, but he didn't. Instead, he took her to a corner of the grocery store, told her to stay quiet, and fired a few shots into the floor to make it look like she was dead, to trick Joseph. 5 days later, on the evening of December 26th, a liquor store became their target. The 65-year-old owner, Cohn, was busy in the store when Joseph and Arthur burst in and shot him in the head. They then emptied the cash register, searched Cohn's pockets, and took all his money. Several minutes later, a customer went into Cohn's liquor store and found his body lying behind the counter. There were no witnesses and the neighbors didn't see or hear anything strange, but the police, who were pretty good at their jobs, figured out straight away that Cohn's murder was linked to the killings of Edward and Daniel on December 15th. The method was always the same. They'd empty the cash registers and wallets of their victims, then shoot them in the head before getting away and leaving no evidence. January 5th, 1957, Joseph and Arthur went on another crime spree, this time targeting a shoe store in North Haven, Connecticut. The owner was Frank, a 44-year-old businessman. At the time, the two crooks burst into the shoe store and forced Frank into a back room, where Arthur grabbed a gun and smashed it violently against Frank's head until he fell into a state of apparent death. But Joseph and Arthur's crimes weren't over yet, as there were still two customers in the store, 48-year-old Bernard and his wife Ruth. Since the couple had witnessed the entire assault on Frank, Bernard and Ruth would become key witnesses that could send Joseph and Arthur to prison if they were not silenced. So, Joseph and Arthur decided to eliminate them. They robbed the couple of their wallets, forced them to kneel on the ground, and shot them in the back of the head with a handgun, ending their lives. After the murder of Bernard and Ruth, the Connecticut police set up a special headquarters in North Haven dedicated to investigating the case. Liquor store operators also began arming themselves and bringing dogs to work in an attempt to fend off the attackers. What's more, Frank, who had been knocked into a state of apparent death, did not die. He was a lucky man. He survived. Frank gave the police a good description of the attacker's appearance when he was in the hospital ward. He remembered that one of the attackers had asked to see shoes in a size 12. And later, while reviewing prison records, police noticed that Joseph wore shoes of the same size. They then showed Frank some photos of Joseph and Arthur, and in the end, Frank was pretty sure that Arthur was one of the attackers. Around 9 o'clock on the evening of January 26th, Joseph and Arthur struck again, this time targeting Rosenthal's drugstore. At the time, 69-year-old John was alone on the first floor of the drugstore, while his son, Henry, was working in the basement. However, Joseph burst into the drugstore and fired 2 shots into John's chest, ending his life. Hearing the gunshots, Henry ran out from the basement and saw Joseph standing next to the cash register, looting the money. In a state of anger and fear, he threw a medicine bottle at Joseph, who fired back at Henry. Fortunately, the bullet only hit the wall. Joseph then fled outside, jumped into a dark-colored Studebaker, and left the scene. Later, Henry gave the officers a description of the attacker. He said the man was tall, between 30 and 40 years old, had black hair, and was wearing a coat. His description matched the clues Frank had given. In the end, police confirmed that Joseph and Arthur were behind the series of crimes. On February 23, 1957, they arrested Joseph and Arthur, charging them with disorderly conduct while awaiting the results of a full investigation into the murder spree. In order to prevent the two from colluding, police deliberately kept them in separate custody. Joseph was detained in the Hartford County Jail, while Arthur was held in the Hartford Police Barracks. 4 days later, after a lot of questioning and some force, Arthur admitted to being involved in 8 robberies and 6 murders, and showed the officers the weapon they'd used to kill Edward and Daniel. When Arthur first came clean, he said that Joseph had fired all the fatal shots, while he himself had only been involved in beating several victims with a handgun and driving their getaway car. Joseph initially insisted he wasn't involved in the crimes, but on March 1st, the police used a clever strategy. They encouraged Joseph's mother to bring a tape recorder and have a chat with Joseph to try and get him to confess. In the end, after his mother had a good nudge, Joseph came clean about all the murders, including the 1950 killing of Louis. Later on, even more shocking was that Joseph and Arthur committed a series of robberies and murders. But according to the police, despite killing several people and committing crimes that impacted the entire state of Connecticut, the loot they obtained amounted to less than $400. In May 1957, Joseph and Arthur stood trial together. The trial focused mostly on the murders of Edward and Daniel. Arthur's attorney tried to use Arthur's mental disability to persuade the jury not to impose the death penalty. He made a heartfelt plea in court saying, "I can't believe that any American jury would sentence Arthur, who has intellectual disabilities, to death." Joseph's attorney said that Joseph had spent 4 years on death row, so his murder spree was partly an act of revenge. He also mentioned something Joseph told the prison psychiatrist. "When I kill someone, they don't think it's wrong that they wanted to kill me." But during the trial, Joseph not only laughed at the evidence against him, he also made threatening gestures at others in the courtroom. This made the jury and spectators even angrier, and it also put his attorneys in a bit of a pickle. After weeks of heated deliberation and presentation of evidence, the jury finally ruled on June 27th that Joseph and Arthur were guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced them to death. The local newspaper also published an editorial in support of the death penalty for the two defendants, stating, "If the death penalty is justified, then it is justified for these two." While waiting to be executed, Joseph attempted suicide twice, but failed both times. Later, he wrote a letter stating that executing a criminal would be kinder than imprisoning them for years. He said he would rather die than spend the rest of his life in prison, and he acted on this by giving up all chances to appeal. On the evening of May 17, 1960, Joseph was executed by electric chair, marking the last time the electric chair was used in Connecticut. Meanwhile, Arthur continued fighting his death sentence. In the end, he accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder, sparing him the death penalty and sentencing him to life in prison. He died in prison on December 22, 1970, of natural causes. In reality, before the Mad Dog killings, the Connecticut governor and local newspapers had been calling for the abolition of the death penalty. But after the killings, the governor's stance shifted drastically. He stated he now supported the death penalty for Joseph and Arthur. Local newspapers also reversed their position, arguing that while the death penalty is neither a deterrent nor a perfect punishment, it is necessary in some cases, much like putting out a fire or putting down a mad dog. When Louis was murdered, his wife moved her family out of Connecticut. When Joseph was arrested, she repeatedly criticized those calling for the abolition of the death penalty, asking, "How does it feel knowing that you and others like you helped a man commit more murders when you could have stopped him after the first one?"